Hello, we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution is the oldest constitution in the world. It is also, I don't think a coincidence, the shortest constitution in the world. And it's just over 4,000 words long. Our Constitution was written by all men, mostly wealthy, all white. Mostly wealthy, but not all of them were wealthy. Some of them would have been middle class. Some of them were retired. Like Benjamin Franklin would have been probably considered middle class. He wasn't wealthy by any means. Other things is and there was a diverse group of ideas coming in there. Some of them, like Alexander Hamilton, wanted very strong government, and others wanted a very weak government. Some wanted the large states to have all the power, and some wanted the states to have an equal share of power. And some wanted a president, some wanted a king. And so there was this whole idea of what is our government going to look like. But that doesn't really inform us as to why we had to have a constitution. It wasn't our first attempt to make a government. That was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were written during the Revolutionary War, which is why they look the way that they do. The Revolutionary War, we're fighting a country that has a large army, has a king, a strong central authority, and a power to tax all the things that we love in life. All right? And so when they established the Articles of Confederation, they wanted kind of the exact opposite. Instead of a central power, strong national government, they wanted a weak national government and all the power residing within the states, the individual states. They wanted a government that could not pass taxes. They could not raise revenue through taxes. They wanted a government that could not maintain a large standing army or even a large standing navy. They pretty much had to take all the navy and put it into the ports and leave it there for a long time because they couldn't afford to send them out. This led to a time period where the government couldn't even mint coins, for example. So every state had to mint its own individual coins. And so you would be trying to do business in Maryland and then go across the river over into Virginia, and you'd have to get all your coins changed. You may even have to pay a tax to bring whatever it is that you're bringing in from Maryland into Virginia, and because every state had its own tax policy. And so this is going to cause a lot of what some historians call an ununified or an ununited States of America. And it's not going to be very effective. Now, that's not to say they didn't get some things done. They actually got three really important things done. Number one is they fought and won the Revolutionary War, and they held the country together while doing so. And this is really kind of a big thing because states could have come in and said, Georgia said, you know what, we're tired of fighting. The fighting's done down here. All the fighting's up in New York and in Virginia and Maryland. So, you know what, I think we're just going to sit this one out. And we're going to negotiate our own separate peace with England. Or New York, they could have come in and said, you know what, we want to expand our country, our state here, so we're going to invade Canada. All right, and we're going to take over Niagara Falls or something like this because the Canadians have the prettier side. And, but the government managed to hold all that down. And so that's kind of a big thing. What's more is at the end of the war, when the United States was going to win, they successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which gave the United States its freedom, which is a kind of a big thing. All right, it established national boundaries. It established fishing rights, rights of transfer of property. It established diplomatic relations between the United States and England. It set national boundaries at the Mississippi and the St. Lawrence rivers, and basically all bodies of water. It is arranged for a peaceful exchange of prisoners and an amnesty for loyalists who fought for England. If they would go to Canada, they'd be allowed to do so without being arrested and hanged and treated as traitors. And so, again, this is a big thing. The other one that they did is they actually did manage to pass one law, which is pretty amazing considering every state gets one vote. And the interests of Georgia are probably very different than the interests of New York or Massachusetts. And so the law that they did pass was called the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance established, it's still in effect today, established what it takes for a state, for a territory to become a state in the United States of America. We started off with 13 states on the East Coast, and now we stretched all the way out to the middle of the Pacific. We have 50 states, and every one of them had to do certain things in order to come in. For example, they had to they had to write a constitution, they had to have an election, they had to have a certain population. But this is the important thing. When they come in, they are states just like New York and Massachusetts and the other original states. There's no, we're the original states and you're the newcomers, so you don't get all the same rights and privileges that we do because we're special. All right, so this allows our country to grow without some of the problems that you could potentially have if you started adding states that were treated as second-class states and the people as second-class citizens. So this is really an important thing. So they did get a lot of things done, but they were still largely ineffective. They couldn't negotiate treaties effectively. They couldn't, especially economic treaties. They couldn't raise money. They couldn't put together an army. All these different things that were problematic. And we're going to see this really come to a head in something called Shay's Rebellion. All right, so Daniel Shay was a Civil War hero. He had fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He had fought with George Washington. He had fought in several different engagements, and he was from Western Massachusetts. And after the Revolutionary War, he comes back home and he wants to farm. But there's some problems. Number one is the taxes are so high in Massachusetts, way higher than they paid when they were part of England, that he doesn't have any money. And what's more is he didn't have any money because there's no coins. There's literally no money to go around. There's no coins to go around. And when banks and other businesses, especially businesses in Boston, wanted you to pay your bills, they wanted it in silver and gold coins, but the national government didn't have the authority, remember, to actually make coins, so there wasn't any to be found. The national government kind of reneged on its agreement to pay some of its veterans, and so he and several others were pretty angry about this, and so they started doing things. It started off sometimes semi-peacefully. I say semi because it's still pretty aggressive to march through town and then surround the courthouses so that the judges can't get into court. Because then, if the judges can't get to court, they can't foreclose on your farms. So you do a lot of intimidation to the judges who are afraid to go in to do their job. And occasionally it kind of escalated into burning courthouses down and other government buildings. And it finally spread through several counties and actually even into New York. And it became a full-blown revolution. All right. But here's the thing. Normally, if you have a revolution, your government puts it down. They come in and they arrest who they have to, shoot people. I mean, this is country running 101. You can't have your citizens burning down your government buildings. It's considered bad. And the problem was the central government didn't have the money to raise an army to stop Shay's rebellion. And ultimately, it actually had to be put down by a combination of the Massachusetts National Guard and businessmen in Boston hiring private armies to protect their stuff, and then they also go out and find the revolutionaries and arrest them and put them on trial and then possibly send them to prison. And so, again, it's kind of hard to run a country when you have to farm out law enforcement to private armies. And it really demonstrated to a lot of people that the government under the Articles of Confederation just wasn't working. It was too weak. And so they sent out word that they were going to modify the Articles of Confederation in Philadelphia. And by modifying, I mean that they were going to wad them up and throw them away and start over. So they have a bit of a different definition than maybe you and I have. All right, and so they come in, and the men who show up and answer this call came from all 50 states. But one of them in particular, a little guy from Virginia named James Madison, came extremely well prepared. See, he wanted to throw out the Articles of Confederation. And so he came with suitcases full of notes. He was a studious guy, and he had studied a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, but he had also studied a lot of his history and had looked at the constitutions and governing documents from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And he had an idea of what he wanted this republic to look like based on Roman ideas. And so he comes in, and he is very well prepared. And before long, and I'll talk in another video about it. I'll make it sound like it's a lot easier than it really was. They managed to write a constitution, right? And through a lot of processes that we'll talk about in class, they even managed to get it ratified by the states. So it becomes the new law of the land, right? And after the Constitution goes into place, there's another rebellion. This one's called the Whisky Rebellion. The Whisky Rebellion gets its name because the government put a tax on bottles of whiskey, and this is this is bad for a couple of reasons. Some of which actually have nothing to do with drinking. Whiskey was used as a means of exchange. Remember, the government doesn't have a lot of money, so they don't have a lot of gold and silver coins to go around. So if you wanted to buy a horse or buy seeds or something like this, you would trade bottles of whiskey. It's called commodity currency. And if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, because unless you drink that whiskey's going to last for a long time. And so then you would take that bottle of whiskey and you would trade it with somebody else, who would trade it with somebody else until probably it gets drunk or dropped, and then you're out, whatever it was. But you could buy horses, you could buy seed, you could do everything except pay taxes in bottles of whiskey, especially in like the Western New York area, Western Massachusetts, some other places like this. So the government comes in and they put a tax on whiskey of 9 cents a gallon. I'm not sure how big a whiskey bottle is, but I'm going to guess it's probably about a quart. And so that would be about 2.25 cents per bottle, which does not sound like a lot, but there was a problem with this. If you were a large producer, a large distiller, then your tax was only 6 cents per gallon, or 1.5 cents per bottle. So this we're treating large businesses in 1787 different than we are treating small businesses and individuals, and a lot of people are very unhappy about this. Another thing that it hurts those small producers, because again, farmers, where they would take some of their crop, turn it into whiskey, and that is their money, that's their medium of exchange. And so if you start coming in and charging money, if you could imagine, it's kind of like an income tax, and people didn't like that very much. And so a lot of people refused to pay their taxes. Remember, I said Americans are really good at ignoring the law, and this was one of those times they're going to try to ignore it. And you have protests. People come in, they march in the streets complaining that this is an unfair law because it treats large businesses differently than small businesses and individuals, and that it's unfair because it's cutting into, and the taxes had to be paid in gold and silver. And they would do things like they would intimidate, surround, threaten, occasionally beat up tax collectors and judges, and that if you showed up with a warrant, you might, and occasionally they would burn down a house or two. Things were looking pretty bad. And in fact, at one point, an army of 700 farmers, some with guns, some with pitchforks and clubs, gathered, and they were marching towards Boston. President George Washington was the first president of the United States. When he was convinced to do something, he got together an army of 1,200 people. So almost twice the size of the army that the Whisky Rebellion people had. All right, and he himself leads the column of experienced soldiers up to Massachusetts to stop the rebellion. When he gets there, he finds 700 people, and they all kind of look at the 1,200 well-armed men, and they look at their clubs and their squirrel guns and their pitchforks, and a lot of them go, "Well, gosh, General Washington, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no rebellion here." And the rebellion was put down really, really fast with very little bloodshed. There were a few people that were arrested. Most of them were acquitted and allowed to go back home with the understanding that you do not mess with General Washington. And what this did was it really was in stark contrast to Shay's Rebellion, where the government was unable to deal with the crisis, and the Whisky Rebellion, where the government very quickly dealt with the crisis, and they did it without a lot of bloodshed. They did it without opening fire on fellow citizens. And so that, for a lot of people, really solidified that maybe this new constitutional government is going to be the way to go. That is going to be the thing to hold on to as the years go on. There was a little bit of a price to pay. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton's political party did become less favored in the polls, and so they were voted out of office. But in general, the Constitution is going to demonstrate that it is successful by the way it handles the Whisky Rebellion versus how the Articles of Confederation government handled Shay's Rebellion and its failure there. All right, that's all I have for now. Here in a few minutes, or I'm going to record another video about how writing the Constitution was just a really challenging ordeal. Until then, have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.